She did not cry at the funeral, not because grief had failed to arrive, but because crying required a kind of surrender she could no longer afford. Her aunt had been the last person in the family who spoke to her without judgment, who asked about her children by name rather than as proof of poor decisions. Now that voice was gone, replaced by the careful distance of relatives who attended out of obligation rather than affection. The service was brief and formal. Words were spoken that felt rehearsed, delivered by a pastor who had never met her aunt, who reduced her life to a sequence of dates and roles that meant nothing. She sat in the third row with her 2 children pressed close on either side. Her daughter's hand was small and warm in hers, her son's shoulder rigid against her arm. They understood enough to be quiet, but not enough to understand what they had lost. After the service, the family gathered in clusters that reformed and dissolved like weather patterns. Her cousins stood near the refreshment table, their voices low but not low enough. Her brother leaned against the wall with his arms crossed, checking his phone with the frequency of someone who wanted to be elsewhere. Her mother moved through the room with practiced grace, accepting condolences as though they were payments owed. No one approached her directly. The space around her remained carefully empty, as if poverty were contagious. She had learned over the years to recognize that particular kind of isolation. It was not hostility exactly, but something quieter and more persistent, disappointment that had calcified into permanence. Her aunt had been different. Even when the money ran out, even when the eviction notices started arriving, even when her marriage collapsed under the weight of debts that could never be repaid, her aunt had remained steady. She had not offered solutions because there were none. She had offered presence, which turned out to be rarer. The reading of the will took place in a small office that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. The lawyer was efficient and unsentimental, moving through the document with the practiced rhythm of someone who had done this many times before. Most of the estate went to her mother. As expected, a few items were designated for specific relatives. Jewelry, furniture, a painting that had hung in the hallway for decades. When her name was called, the room grew quieter. She felt the shift in attention, subtle but unmistakable. Her mother's posture stiffened. Her brother glanced up from his phone. Her cousins exchanged looks that communicated more than words. The lawyer continued without pause. To her niece, the lawyer read, "I leave the antique mirror from my bedroom, along with my hope that she will see in it what I always saw in her." The silence that followed was not respectful. It was stunned, then faintly amused. Her cousin laughed first, a short sound quickly suppressed. Her brother shook his head slowly. Her mother's expression remained neutral, but her disappointment was evident in the slight tightening around her mouth. An old mirror. That was what she had been left. Not money to cover the rent that was 3 months overdue. Not help with the medical bills that arrived weekly like accusations. Not relief from the constant calculations that governed every purchase, every meal, every decision. A mirror, her brother spoke first, his voice carrying the kind of casual cruelty that people mistake for honesty. "Well, at least you can check if your luck's changed." The comment drew quiet laughter from others in the room. She did not respond. She had learned that silence was often the only defense available to those without resources. After the reading concluded, the family dispersed quickly. There were no invitations to lunch, no suggestions to stay in touch. Her mother kissed her children briefly, then left without meeting her eyes. Her brother nodded in her direction as he passed, already talking on his phone. Her cousins gathered their things and departed in pairs, their conversations resuming the moment they reached the parking lot. She remained seated, waiting for the room to empty, waiting for the weight in her chest to settle into something manageable. The lawyer returned to gather the documents, moving with the same efficient detachment he had shown throughout the proceedings. "Excuse me," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "The mirror. When can I collect it?" The lawyer glanced at his notes. "It's still at your aunt's residence. The property is being cleared next week. You're welcome to retrieve it any time before then." He handed her a key, its weight surprising in her palm. "Just lock up when you're finished." The drive to her aunt's house took 40 minutes, longer than it should have, because her car's engine had been making a sound she could not afford to investigate. Her children sat in the back seat, their voices filling the silence with questions she answered automatically. Her attention divided between the road and the thoughts that circled, like birds unable to land. Her aunt's house stood at the end of a quiet street where the trees grew tall and the yards were carefully maintained. It was modest compared to the homes around it, but it had always felt larger than its dimensions suggested. She had spent summers here as a child, afternoons that stretched without urgency, dinners that lasted until dark. Now the house looked smaller, diminished somehow, as if it had been holding itself together through her aunt's presence alone. The lawn needed mowing. The paint on the shutters had begun to peel. A realtor's sign stood near the mailbox, announcing that the property would soon belong to someone else. She unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of lavender and old wood. Dust moved slowly through the afternoon light, settling and rising in gentle patterns. Her children followed behind her, their footsteps loud against the hardwood floors. The mirror hung in her aunt's bedroom, positioned above the dresser where it had been for as long as she could remember. It was large, nearly 5 feet tall. Its frame ornate and heavy, dark wood carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift depending on the angle of observation. The glass itself was old, slightly warped in places, reflecting the room with a softness that modern mirrors lacked. She stood before it, studying her reflection. The face that looked back was older than she felt, lined with exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. Her clothes were clean but worn, mended in places she hoped were not obvious. Her hair needed cutting. Her expression carried a weariness that had become permanent. Her daughter appeared beside her in the reflection, her small face serious. "It's pretty," she said. "Why didn't Grandma want it?" Her son remained near the door, his arms crossed in unconscious imitation of his uncle. "Can we take it home?" She reached out and touched the frame, feeling the depth of the carvings beneath her fingers. The wood was cool and smooth, polished by years of handling. Up close, she could see the craftsmanship more clearly. Each carved element connected to the next with seamless precision. Flowers merged into vines, vines into geometric patterns that folded back on themselves without beginning or end. "I don't know how we'll move it," she said, speaking more to herself than to her children. "It's heavy." Her son stepped closer, examining the sides. "There are hooks on the back. We could unhook it." She lifted one edge carefully, testing the weight. He was right. 2 substantial hooks secured the mirror to the wall, mounted into studs behind the plaster. She would need to remove those first, then figure out how to transport something this large in a car designed for practical economy rather than cargo. "Wait here," she told her children, and went to search for tools. Her aunt's garage was organized with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized everything she did. Tools hung on pegboards, labeled and accessible. Boxes were stacked neatly along the walls, their contents marked in careful handwriting. She found a screwdriver, a small hammer, and a moving blanket, then returned to the bedroom. The children had wandered into other rooms, their voices distant. She was grateful for the moment alone. She positioned herself behind the mirror and began working on the first hook. The screws were old but not rusted, turning with steady resistance. Worked, she became aware of how quiet the house had grown. Not empty, quiet, but waiting quiet. The first hook came free, and she supported the mirror's weight with her shoulder while she worked on the second. The frame was even heavier than she had anticipated. The wood, dense and solid. When the second hook released, she guided the mirror down carefully, angling it away from the wall. Something shifted inside the frame, a faint sound, barely audible, like paper sliding against wood. She froze, listening. The sound did not repeat. She lowered the mirror further, resting its bottom edge on the dresser, and examined the back. The backing was original, she realized. Not the thin cardboard used in modern frames, but wood fitted into grooves along the inner edge of the frame. The surface was dark with age, marked with small labels and stamps that had faded beyond legibility. In one corner, someone had written a date in ink that had turned brown. 1894. She ran her fingers along the edges, feeling for loose sections. The backing was secure, fitted tightly, but there was a slight gap near the bottom left corner, as if the wood had warped minimally over time. She pressed gently, testing. The backing end shifted fractionally, then settled back. The sound came again, definitely paper or something paper thin, caught between the mirror glass and its backing. She thought of the old photographs, sometimes stored in antique frames, the love letters tucked behind portraits, the small preservations of sentiment that families carried forward without explanation. Her aunt had loved history. She had collected old things, not for value, but for the stories they carried. The mirror might contain something similar, a photograph perhaps, a letter, something personal that her aunt had wanted, kept close but private. She considered leaving it undisturbed, respecting whatever privacy her aunt had maintained. But curiosity pushed back against restraint. If there was something there, something meant to be preserved, it did deserve acknowledged rather than lost. When the house changed hands, she returned to the garage and found a thin putty knife, the kind used for delicate work. Back in the bedroom, she positioned the mirror carefully on the floor, propped against the dresser at a safe angle. Her hands were steadier than she expected as she worked the blade into the gap at the corner, applying gentle pressure. The backing resisted at first, held by decades of compression and the natural settling of wood. She worked slowly, moving the blade incrementally, feeling for the point where resistance would yield. When it did, the backing lifted slightly, creating enough space for her to see what lay beneath. Paper, definitely paper, but not a single sheet. Multiple sheets layered carefully, protected by the frame's solid construction. She widened the gap carefully, supporting the loosened section of backing with her free hand. The paper was old, yellowed at the edges, but remarkably preserved. She worked the putty knife further along the frame's edge, releasing more of the backing. As the gap widened, she could see that the papers had been folded, compressed to fit the available space. They were not random insertions, but deliberate placements arranged to fill the entire area between mirror and backing. Her pulse quickened despite her efforts to remain calm. This was not a single photograph or letter. This was intentional storage. Her aunt had hidden something here, something she wanted protected but accessible, something worth preserving in a place where it would remain undiscovered unless someone specifically looked. She freed enough of the backing to slip her fingers behind it and began to extract the papers carefully. They came out in sections, stuck together lightly by time and compression. The first bundle consisted of letters, their envelopes yellowed but intact. The handwriting on the front was unfamiliar. The addresses written in an elegant script that suggested another era. She set them aside gently and reached for more. The next section was different, heavier paper, stiffer. She pulled it free and unfolded it carefully. It was a document official, looking with elaborate borders and seals. The text was dense, filled with legal language and formal declarations. She scanned it quickly, not fully comprehending the details, but recognizing its importance from the weight of its presentation. More papers followed, certificates, documents, letters bound with ribbon. Each bundle revealed itself slowly, preserved with care, protected from light and air and the casual damage of handling. Her hands moved faster now, pulling free the contents with growing urgency, no longer careful to maintain the backing's integrity. When the space was finally empty, she sat back on her heels and stared at what lay before her. Dozens of documents spread across the bedroom floor, letters in languages she did not recognize, certificates bearing stamps and signatures that looked official but unfamiliar, and beneath them all wrapped in tissue that had turned brittle with age, something else. She lifted the tissue carefully and peeled it back, her breath caught. Inside were stock certificates, their borders ornate, their printing precise. She recognized some of the company names from news reports, from business sections she sometimes glimpsed while waiting in grocery store lines. These were not historical curiosities. These were active companies, major companies. Her hands trembled as she picked up the first certificate and examined it closely. The number of shares was printed clearly at the top. 1,000 shares. The date of issue was decades old, but that did not matter. What mattered was that these certificates, if authentic, represented ownership, real ownership in companies that had not only survived but thrived. She set it down carefully and reached for the next one. 2,000 shares. Different company. Same era. The next bundle contained even more certificates, stacked and bound with a ribbon that fell apart when she touched it. She stopped counting after the first 10 certificates. The numbers were too large, the implications too vast. This was not a small inheritance. This was not a sentimental gesture. This was wealth. Substantial, undeniable wealth, hidden inside a frame that her family had dismissed as worthless, that they had mocked her for receiving, that they had laughed about in a lawyer's office, while she sat silent and humiliated. Her children's voices drifted in from another room, their words indistinct, but cheerful. They did not know yet, They could not know. She barely understood it herself. She gathered the certificates carefully, stacking them in order, her mind racing through questions that had no immediate answers. Why had her aunt hidden these? What's here? Why had she not mentioned them in the will? Why leave them for discovery rather than declaration? The questions circled but found no purchase. What mattered now was not why, but what. She stood slowly, her legs unsteady, and walked to the window. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the yard. The realtor's sign stood visible from this angle, a reminder that time was limited. The house would be cleared. New owners would arrive. This discovery existed in a narrow window between her aunt's death and the world's indifference. She returned to the documents and began examining them more carefully, one by one. Some were stock certificates, as she had thought. Others were bonds, their terms and yields printed in small text that required close attention. Others still were documents she did not fully understand. Agreements and contracts that spoke of investments and holdings and percentages that meant nothing to her untrained eye. But interspersed among the financial documents were personal papers. Letters written in her aunt's handwriting, addressed to no one or perhaps to her, explaining in careful detail what each certificate represented, what each document meant, how they had been acquired, and why they had been preserved. She read one letter, slowly, her aunt's voice clear in every sentence. The stocks had been purchased over decades. Small investments made consistently, quietly, without fanfare or family knowledge. Her aunt had worked, saved, invested with discipline that defied the modest appearance of her life. She had built something substantial, not through luck or inheritance, but through patience. The letter explained why the documents had been hidden. Her aunt had witnessed how money changed families, how it created expectations and entitlement, how it drew attention from people who cared more about wealth than the person who held it. She had wanted to live without that burden, to maintain relationships based on something other than financial potential. But she had also wanted the wealth to serve a purpose eventually. She had chosen her beneficiary carefully. Not the person who needed money least, but the person who needed it most. Not the relative who would preserve wealth for its own sake, but the one who would use it to build something better. Not her mother, comfortable in her judgment. Not her brother, secure in his dismissal. Not her cousins, who had never asked how she was managing. Her, the one they had laughed at, the one they had pied, the one who had sat silent in a lawyer's office while they mocked the only thing she had been left. She folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Her hands were no longer trembling. Her thoughts had begun to organize themselves into sequence rather than chaos. She understood what needed to happen next. Not all of it, but enough to begin. First, she needed to secure everything. The documents were valuable beyond measure, but they were also fragile, vulnerable to loss or damage. She gathered them carefully, returning them to the space behind the mirror's backing, then reconsidered. That hiding place had served its purpose. It was time for these documents to exist in the open, protected by proper channels rather than obscurity. She found a sturdy box in the garage, lined it with tissue paper, and transferred the documents carefully. Each certificate, each bond, each letter was placed with attention to order and preservation. When the box was full, she sealed it and carried it to her car, placing it in the trunk beneath the spare tire, where it would remain hidden but accessible. Her children found her in the bedroom as she was replacing the backing on the mirror's frame. "Mom, can we go? We're hungry." She looked at them, really looked, and felt something shift inside her. They were young enough to be protected from the full weight of their circumstances, but old enough to sense it. They had learned to expect disappointment, to accept limits without question, to ask for less because asking for more invited rejection. That was about to change. "Yes," she said, "we can go, but first help me carry this to the car." Together, they maneuvered the mirror down the stairs, through the front door, and secured it carefully in the back seat. It fit awkwardly, requiring creative positioning, but they managed. When they were finished, she locked her aunt's house and stood for a moment on the front step, key in hand. The house looked the same as it had an hour ago. The realtor's sign still stood in the yard. The lawn still needed mowing, but everything had changed. Her aunt's final gift had been delivered, not with ceremony or explanation, but with trust. Trust that she would find it. Trust that she would understand what it meant. Trust that she would do what needed to be done. She drove home slowly, hyper-aware of every turn, every bump in the road. The mirror sat behind her, its reflection capturing the fading light. Her children talked about dinner, about a show they wanted to watch, about ordinary things that felt newly precious, because they were about to become less desperate. Their apartment building came into view, its 3 stories of weathered brick and narrow windows unchanged by her knowledge. The same car sat in the parking lot. The same broken light flickered above the entrance. The same smell of cooking oil and chemical cleaners greeted her as she unlocked the door. But she was different now. She carried something that would alter everything, and the weight of it was both exhilarating and terrifying. She helped her children carry the mirror up 2 flights of stairs, its bulk requiring stops at each landing. When they finally reached their apartment, she propped it against the wall in her bedroom and told the children to wash up for dinner. While they were occupied, she retrieved the box from her car and brought it inside, storing it in the back of her closet behind clothes and shoes, hidden in plain sight. Then she stood in the small kitchen, looking at the contents of her refrigerator, and made a decision. Tonight they would eat what they had. Tomorrow everything would begin to change, but she would not rush it. She would not make the mistakes that came from desperation or excitement. She would be methodical, careful, disciplined like her aunt had been. She would build something lasting rather than something spectacular. She prepared dinner with more attention than usual, as if the ordinary act of making pasta and sauce had taken on ceremonial significance. Her children ate without complaint, unaware of the transformation, waiting just beyond their understanding. After dinner, she helped them with homework, listened to their stories about school, tucked them into bed with the same routine they had always known. Only when they were asleep did she return to her bedroom and open the box once more. She spread the documents across her bed, studying each one by the light of her bedside lamp. There were patterns in the holdings, strategies in the selection of companies, wisdom in the diversification. Her aunt had not been lucky. She had been smart. She took out her phone and began searching for information. Company valuations, stock prices, current holdings, the numbers were almost incomprehensible. Even accounting for taxes, for legal fees, for the complexity of transferring these holdings into her name, the sum was staggering. Generational wealth, life-changing wealth, freedom measured not in comfort. She thought about her family, about the reading of the will, about the laughter that had followed the announcement of her inheritance. They had seen an old mirror. They had seen evidence of their own assumptions confirmed. They had seen what they had always seen, someone to be pied rather than respected. They had been wrong, entirely, spectacularly wrong, and soon they would know it. That thought brought her both satisfaction and unease. She did not want revenge. Exactly. She wanted recognition. Acknowledgement that she was more than their judgments had allowed. Proof that their dismissal had been based on circumstance rather than character. But first came the practical work. She needed to understand what she had inherited, not just in financial terms, but in practical ones. She needed lawyers who specialized in estate transfers. She needed financial advisors who could help manage holdings of this size. She needed accountants who understood tax implications for sudden wealth. Most importantly, she needed discretion. If word spread before she had secured these assets properly, complications would follow. Family members would question the legitimacy of the inheritance. Lawyers might be consulted. The will might be challenged. Not on legal grounds necessarily, but on emotional ones, the kind that create delay and expense and uncertainty. She would tell no one yet, not her children, not her friends, not anyone. The secret would remain exactly that until everything was properly established, until the wealth had been transferred completely and irrevocably into her control. She carefully returned the documents to their box and stored it in her closet once more. Then she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind too active for sleep. The life she had known, the one defined by scarcity and struggle, was ending. What replaced it would be shaped by the decisions she made now. In these first hours of understanding, her aunt had trusted her with this, not just with wealth, but with the wisdom to use it properly. That trust felt heavier than the financial burden, more demanding than any amount of money. She could not squander it. She could not become the person her family assumed she would become if fortune smiled upon her. Frivolous, careless, changed by comfort into someone unrecognizable. She would prove them wrong, not by flaunting wealth, but by building something meaningful with it. She would prove that poverty had not defined her character, only her circumstances, and she would do it quietly with the same discipline her aunt had shown, so that when they finally understood what had happened, they would have no choice but to acknowledge what they had missed. As sleep finally began to claim her, one thought rose above the others and refused to be dismissed. The mirror her family had laughed about. The inheritance they had mocked had contained more wealth than any of them would likely see in their lifetimes, and she alone had been trusted to find it. The morning arrived without ceremony, grey light filtering through the thin curtains of her bedroom. She woke before her alarm, her mind already moving through the day's requirements with unusual clarity. Her children needed to be fed, dressed, and delivered to school. She needed to work her shift at the grocery store. 8 hours of scanning items and making change and standing until her feet ached. The routine was familiar, almost comforting in its predictability. But beneath that surface routine, another layer of awareness pulsed steadily. The box in her closet, the documents it contained, the future it represented. She pushed the thoughts aside, deliberately allowing herself this final morning of normality before everything changed. Breakfast was quick. Cereals and milk, orange juice poured into plastic cups. Her daughter talked about a field trip coming up next month. Permission slip required, $5 for admission. Her son mentioned needing new shoes, his current pair splitting along the sole. Small needs that until yesterday had felt enormous. Calculations that required shifting other expenses, juggling dates on bills, choosing which necessity to delay. "I'll take care of it," she said, and meant it in a way she never had before. They heard only the words, not the weight behind them. "Good," her daughter said. "Can we have pancakes tomorrow? We haven't had pancakes in forever," she said. Yes, tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow she would make calls, begin the process of transformation. Today was for maintaining appearances, for not drawing attention, for letting the world continue to see what it expected. The drive to school was routine. Her car made the same troubling sound, the engine rattling in a way that suggested expensive repairs. She could now afford, but would not yet pursue. Not until everything was secured. Not until the wealth was transferred properly, and the danger of loss had passed. She kissed her children goodbye at the school entrance and watched them join the flow of students moving toward the building. They looked like every other child, backpacks heavy, movements quick. No one looking at them would guess what was about to change. That anonymity felt important, protective. The grocery store where she worked stood at the edge of a shopping center. Its sign faded, its parking lot dotted with potholes. She had worked there for 3 years, long enough that the routine required no conscious thought. Clock in, tie apron, stand at register 7, begin the rhythm of scan and bag, interrupted only by price checks and customer complaints and the occasional need to call for a manager. Her co-workers greeted her with familiar nods. Deb, working register 8, complained about her schedule. Miguel, stocking produce, mentioned his daughter's upcoming graduation. Carol, the assistant manager, reminded everyone about the policy update regarding break times. The conversation flowed around her, requiring minimal participation, allowing her to maintain presence without full attention. As she scanned items throughout the morning, her thoughts returned persistently to the documents in her closet. She had researched late into the night after the children slept, learning what she could about the companies whose stock she now apparently owned. Technology firms, pharmaceutical companies, consumer goods manufacturers. Each one a name she recognized dimly from news reports or advertisements, transformed now into something personal and immediate. The stock certificates dated back decades, purchased when those companies were younger, less proven, significantly cheaper. Her aunt had invested small amounts consistently, choosing companies not for quick returns, but for long-term stability. Over time, through splits and growth and reinvested dividends, those small investments had multiplied beyond recognition. One certificate she had studied particularly carefully represented shares in a technology company that had grown to dominate its market. The 1,000 shares, purchased 40 years ago, had split multiple times, grown into tens of thousands of shares, each one now worth hundreds of dollars. That single certificate alone was worth more than she would earn in a decade at her current job. And there were dozens more. She waited 3 days before making the first call, not out of indecision, but strategy. The certificates required verification by professionals who specialized in estate transfers and historical securities. Finding the right people meant research, reading reviews, checking credentials, eliminating anyone whose discretion seemed questionable. She spent her breaks at work, searching on her phone, scanning through law firm websites, reading about fiduciary responsibility and estate law. The language was dense, filled with terms she had to look up repeatedly, but she pushed through with the same determination that had carried her through years of managing impossible budgets. The children noticed nothing. Her routine remained unchanged. Morning drop-offs at school, 8-hour shifts at the grocery store, evening pickups, dinner preparations, homework, supervision. The only difference was internal, a steady awareness that hummed beneath everything she did, transforming mundane tasks into something provisional, temporary. On Thursday evening, after the children were asleep, she sat at a small kitchen table with a notebook and began making lists, not wish lists or dreams, but practical steps arranged in order of necessity. First, verification of the certificate's authenticity. Second, legal transfer of ownership. Third, establishment of proper accounts and management structures. Fourth, tax consultation. Fifth, long-term planning. Each step required specialists, people she would need to trust with information that could alter her life irrevocably. The thought tightened something in her chest. She had spent years learning to rely on no one, to expect disappointment, to build walls against vulnerability. Now she would have to open those walls deliberately, let strangers into the most important discovery of her life. She chose the law firm carefully, not the largest in the city, but established enough to have reputation and resources. Their website emphasized estate planning and wealth transfer using language that suggested experience with complex inheritances. She called Friday morning during her break. Standing in the parking lot behind the grocery store, where the dumpsters created privacy, the receptionist was professional but not warm, asking questions that felt like gatekeeping: nature of the inquiry, referral source, general value of the estate. She answered carefully, revealing enough to secure an appointment, but not enough to expose the full scope of what she had found. The appointment was set for Monday afternoon. She would need to request time off from work, something that required justification to her manager. She fabricated a medical appointment. Hating the lie, but recognizing its necessity, Carol approved it with minimal questions, adding only that she would need to make up the hours later in the week. The weekend passed slowly. She cleaned the apartment with unusual thoroughness, as if preparing for guests who would never arrive. She took the children to the park, watched them play, and tried to be present in the moment, while her thoughts circled relentlessly around Monday's meeting. Saturday night, she removed the box from her closet and examined the documents again. This time with different eyes, not wonder, but calculation. She organized them by type. Stock certificates in one stack, bonds in another, personal letters from her aunt in a third. She made detailed notes about each item, recording company names, share quantities, issue dates, certificate numbers. The process took hours. When she finally returned everything to the box and hid it once more, her hand was cramped from writing, and her eyes burned with fatigue. But she had what she needed: a complete inventory, proof of diligence, evidence that she understood what she possessed. Monday arrived with rain that matched her nervous energy. She dressed carefully, choosing clothes that were professional but not pretentious. Her best slacks, the blouse she saved for parent-teacher conferences, shoes that were worn but clean. She wanted to appear competent, serious, worthy of attention, without seeming to try too hard. The law firm occupied the 7th floor of a downtown building that smelled of carpet cleaner. The elevator was smooth and silent, nothing like the one in her apartment building with its grinding cables and stuttering stops. When the doors opened, she stepped into a reception area that communicated success, restraint rather than ostentation. The receptionist, a woman near her own age, greeted her with practiced courtesy. She gave her name, confirmed her appointment time, and was directed to a seating area where leather chairs faced floor-to-ceiling windows. She sat, the box containing the documents resting on her lap, and waited. The lawyer, who eventually appeared, was younger than she expected, perhaps 40, with silver threading his dark hair in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. He introduced himself as Michael Reeves, extended his hand, and guided her toward a conference room without excessive pleasantry. The room was smaller than she had imagined, its tables sized for intimate discussions rather than large gatherings. He gestured to a chair, took his own across from her, and folded his hands with attentive patience. "You mentioned an inheritance," he began. "Why don't you tell me what brings you here?" She had rehearsed this moment, but the words still felt awkward leaving her mouth. "My aunt passed away recently. In her will, she left me an antique mirror. When I examined it, I found documents hidden in the frame backing, stock certificates, bonds, letters. I need to know if they're authentic and what needs to happen to transfer them legally into my name." His expression did not change dramatically, but something shifted in his posture, a sharpening of attention. "May I see documents?" She opened the box and began removing items carefully, placing them on the table in the order she had organized them. He watched without reaching out, allowing her to arrange everything before he touched anything. When she finished, he leaned forward and began examining each certificate methodically. The silence stretched. She forced herself not to fill it with nervous explanation. He would either believe her or he would not. The documents would be authentic or they would not. Her words could not change either outcome. After several minutes, he looked up. "These appear genuine. Obviously, I will need to verify that with the transfer agents, but the printing, the paper quality, the seals, everything suggests authenticity." He paused, studying her face. "Do you understand what you have here?" "I think so," she said quietly. "A lot of my money." A corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile. "That's accurate, but insufficient. What you have here is generational wealth. Life-changing wealth. If these certificates are genuine and properly transferred, you are looking at holdings worth well over $200 million. The number landed differently when spoken aloud by someone else. She had calculated it herself, checked and rechecked the math, but hearing it confirmed by a professional made it real in a way that private knowledge had not. She felt suddenly dizzy, the room tilting slightly before stabilizing. "Are you all right?" His voice carried concern without condescension. "Yes," she managed. "It's just I knew the number, but hearing you say it." He nodded. "That's a normal reaction. Now, let me explain what happens next. First, we need to verify each certificate with the respective company's transfer agents. That process can take several weeks. Second, we will need to establish your legal right to these assets through your aunt's estate. Do you have a copy of the will?" Yes. She had brought it folded in the back of the box. He examined it carefully, reading the relevant section multiple times. "This is straightforward. The mirror and its contents were left to you explicitly. As long as no one contests the will, and there is no reason they should, based on this language, transfer will be clean. What if someone does contest it?" The question emerged before she could stop it. "On what grounds?" His response was immediate, sharp. "The will is clear. Your aunt had testamentary capacity. She specified exactly what she was leaving and to whom. Unless someone can prove fraud or undue influence, which would be nearly impossible given that the documents were hidden, there is no legitimate basis for challenge." She felt something loosened in her chest. "My family, they laughed when I inherited the mirror. They thought it was worthless." His expression remained neutral, professional. "Many people underestimate the value of antiques. That works in your favor. Now, their dismissal means they are unlikely to suspect what you have found. My advice is to keep this confidential until the transfer is complete. Once everything is properly in your name, they can learn whatever you choose to tell them." The meeting continued for another hour. He explained the verification process, the timeline she should expect, the documentation she would need to provide. He discussed tax implications, suggesting she would need to consult with a CPA who specialized in large inheritances. He mentioned wealth management, the need for proper investment strategies, the importance of protecting assets once they were transferred. Before she left, he asked a question that surprised her. "What do you plan to do with this wealth?" She had not expected to be asked, had not prepared an answer. She thought of her children sleeping in the bedroom they shared, of the eviction notice that had arrived 2 months ago, of the medical bills stacked on her kitchen counter. of the thousands of small indignities that accompanied poverty. First, she said, I'm going to make sure my children are secure. Education, healthcare, housing, everything they need. Then I don't know yet. I want to do something meaningful, something my aunt would have approved of. But I need time to think about what that means. He nodded, apparently satisfied. That is a good answer. Restraint is rare in people who suddenly acquire wealth. Hold on to it, he stood, extending his hand once more. I will begin the verification process immediately. Expect to hear from me within the week. She left the building feeling both lighter and heavier. Lighter because she had taken the first real step, sought professional guidance, begun the process of transformation. Heavier because the enormity of what lay ahead had become tangible. The rain had stopped. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building, the box once again in her hands, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. People moved past her, intent on their own concerns, unaware that the woman they brushed against carried documents worth more than most of them would earn in a lifetime. She returned to work the next day and the day after that, scanning groceries, making change, maintaining the routine that had defined her life for years. But everything felt slightly removed now, as if she were watching herself perform a role rather than living it directly. Deb complained about her ex-husband's missed child support payments. Miguel worried about paying for his daughter's college. Carol stressed over labor costs and profit margins. Their concerns were real, immediate, pressing. She listened and responded appropriately, but could not shake the awareness that she was no longer part of the same struggle. The call from Michael Reeves came on Thursday earlier than expected. She took it in the parking lot during her lunch break, standing in the shadow of the building where she had stood before. Good news, he said without preamble. I have heard back from 3 of the transfer agents. The certificates are authentic. The shares are valid. We can proceed with the transfer. Relief flooded through her, and the others still waiting on confirmation. But I have no reason to believe they will be different. Based on current market values, and this is a conservative estimate, you are looking at approximately $246 million. The number hit her again harder this time. She had calculated something similar, but hearing it spoken with professional certainty was different. 246 million. Not thousands, not hundreds of thousands. Millions, plural, beyond comprehension. What happens next? Her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Next, we begin the legal transfer process. I will need you to sign several documents establishing your right to the inheritance. We will work with the transfer agents to move the shares into your name. Simultaneously, we will set up proper financial structures, accounts, trusts, whatever makes sense for your situation. This process will take approximately 6 to 8 weeks. 6 to 8 weeks. She could manage that. She had managed far longer with far less. There is one more thing, he continued. Have you told anyone about this? Family? Friends? Anyone? No. No one. Good. Keep it that way. Once word spreads, complications follow. People will have opinions about what you should do with the money. They will have needs they expect you to meet. Some will approach you directly. Others will go through channels you do not anticipate. Secrecy is not just about security. It is about preserving your freedom to make decisions on your own terms. She understood what he was not saying. Her family, her mother, her brother, her cousins would have expectations. They would feel entitled to share in the wealth because blood created obligation in ways that respect and kindness never had. Keeping the secret meant keeping control. I understand, she said. I will tell no one. The conversation ended with logistical details, documents she would need to gather, appointments she would need to attend. When she hung up, she stood motionless for several minutes, processing what she had just learned. Authentic, valid $246. The afternoon shift passed in a blur. She moved through her tasks automatically, her body present, while her mind orbited the knowledge she carried. When her shift ended, she picked up her children from school and drove home with unusual care, hyper-aware of every other vehicle, every intersection, every potential threat to the future she was beginning to imagine. That evening, she allowed herself a small indulgence. She ordered pizza for dinner, not from the discount chain they usually chose, but from the local restaurant with the good reviews and higher prices. Her children noticed immediately. Pizza from Marinos? Her daughter asked, her tone suggesting she understood this represented deviation from normal patterns. What is the special occasion? No occasion, she said, keeping her voice light. I just thought we deserved something nice. They ate together at the small kitchen table. The children animated in ways that good food encouraged. They told stories about their day, their teachers, their friends. She listened more carefully than usual, committing details to memory, aware that these ordinary moments were numbered. Soon their lives would change. They would move from this apartment to something larger, safer, better maintained. They would attend better schools, have access to opportunities she had only been able to imagine. But they would also lose something, the shared understanding of scarcity, the bond that forms between people who struggle together. She was not sentimental about poverty. It taught lessons, but they were harsh lessons that came at too high a cost. Her children deserved more than character-building hardship. They deserved security, possibility, the freedom to make choices based on preference rather than necessity. After dinner, after homework and baths and bedtime stories, she sat alone in her bedroom, with the mirror propped against the wall. She studied her reflection, looking for visible changes. Her face was the same. Her clothes were the same. Nothing external had shifted, but something internal had transformed completely. The woman looking back at her was no longer someone defined by what she lacked. She was someone with resources, with options, with power that came from wealth, and the freedom it provided. She thought about her family, about the funeral, about the reading of the will. She thought about her mother's tight expression, her brother's dismissive head shake, her cousin's poorly suppressed laughter. They had seen what they expected to see. A failure receiving a worthless gesture. They had been catastrophically wrong. The satisfaction that thought brought was complicated. She was not a vindictive person. She did not fantasize about rubbing their faces in their mistake, but she wanted them to know. She wanted her mother to understand that her judgments had been based on circumstance rather than insight, wanted her brother to recognize that dismissal was not the same as wisdom. She wanted her cousins to realize that their laughter had been premature. But not yet. Not until everything was secured. Not until the wealth was transferred irrevocably into her name, protected by legal structures that could not be easily challenged or dismantled. Patience had carried her through poverty. It would carry her through this transition as well. The weeks that followed established a strange rhythm. Externally, her life remained unchanged. She worked her shifts, paid her bills with the limited funds available, navigated the constant calculations that governed every purchase. But internally, she existed in a state of sustained anticipation, waiting for the final confirmations, the completed transfers, the moment when possibility became reality. Michael Reeves called weekly with updates. Transfer agents confirmed authenticity. Legal documents were prepared and signed. Financial accounts were established in her name, waiting to receive assets worth more than small nations' economies. Each step moved forward without complication, building toward conclusion with mechanical inevitability. She met with the tax specialist he recommended, a woman named Patricia Chen, whose office was decorated with certificates and awards, suggesting both expertise and success. They spent 3 hours discussing strategies for minimizing tax burden while remaining fully compliant. The conversation was technical, dense with terms like capital gains and cost basis and qualified dividends, but Patricia explained everything with patient clarity. "You will owe taxes," she said finally. "There is no way around that, but with proper planning, we can structure things so you keep the maximum amount legally possible. You are looking at somewhere between 35 and 40% in combined federal and state taxes. That still leaves you with over $150 million. $150 million after taxes." After every legitimate deduction and legal strategy, the number refused to feel real. Even as it became increasingly certain, Patricia leaned back in her chair, studying her with open curiosity. "May I ask a personal question?" She nodded, wary but willing. "How are you handling this? Most people who come into sudden wealth experience significant stress. Some describe it as overwhelming." She considered the question seriously before answering. "I think I am in shock. Not the dramatic kind, but the sustained kind. I keep waiting to wake up or for someone to tell me there has been a mistake. At the same time, I am trying to stay focused on the practical steps because that feels manageable. The emotional part, the reality of what this means, I think that will hit me later." Patricia nodded. "That is a healthier approach." When the emotional impact does arrive, and it will, do not hesitate to seek support. Therapists who specialize in sudden wealth exist for exactly this reason. Solve some problems, but creates others. Being prepared for that is important. The comment stayed with her. She had always associated wealth with solution, with the end of difficulty. It had not occurred to her that new problems might emerge, different in kind but equally real. The thought was unsettling. By the 6th week, most of the verifications were complete. Only 2 certificates remained pending, both from smaller companies whose transfer agents moved more slowly. Michael Reeves assured her this was normal, that the delays meant nothing except bureaucratic inefficiency. She began to allow herself small planning exercises, nothing dramatic, nothing that required spending money she did not yet possess, but mental sketches of how life might change. A larger apartment, maybe a small house, a reliable car that did not make concerning sounds, new clothes for the children, not just functional but nice. College funds fully established, not hoped for, but guaranteed. She also thought about work. She would need to quit eventually, not immediately, not in a way that would draw attention, but soon. The thought brought equal parts relief and guilt. The job was exhausting, poorly paid, often demeaning, but it was also stability, routine, the framework around which she had built her survival. Leaving would mean admitting that the life she had lived was over. That person who woke at 5:30 to get children ready for school, who stood for 8 hours scanning groceries, who calculated every purchase down to the penny, that person would cease to exist. Someone new would take her place. The 7th week brought the final confirmations. All certificates authentic, all shares valid, all transfers ready to proceed. Michael Reeves called with the news on a Tuesday afternoon. "We are ready," he said. "The paperwork is complete. I need you to come in and sign the final documents. Once you do, the transfer will be executed within 48 hours. By Friday, you will be legally and irrevocably the owner of assets worth $246 million. She took a breath, held it, released it, slowly. "When?" "Tomorrow morning, 10. "Can you make that work?" "Yes," she said. "I will be there." She called Carol immediately after, requesting time off for another fabricated medical appointment. Carol agreed with less patience than before, noting that she was using a lot of personal time lately. She apologized without explanation, knowing that soon Carol's irritation would be irrelevant. That evening, she told her children they would be staying with a friend the next morning before school. They accepted the change without suspicion. Accustomed to occasional disruptions in routine, she made dinner, supervised homework, read bedtime stories with unusual attention, as if these ordinary acts were becoming precious through their impermanence. When they were asleep, she stood at her bedroom window and looked out at the parking lot below. Cars sat in their assigned spaces. Security lights created pools of yellow against darkness. Everything appeared exactly as it always had. But tomorrow, everything would change. She did not sleep well. Dreams came fragmented and anxious, full of missed appointments and lost documents and phone calls that brought bad news. She woke repeatedly, checking the time, calculating hours remaining, then forcing herself back toward rest that never fully arrived. Morning came early. She dressed with more care than usual, choosing the same professional outfit she had worn to her first meeting with Michael Reeves. She dropped the children at her neighbor's apartment, promising to pick them up before school started, then drove downtown through light traffic that seemed designed to move her toward destiny. The law firm's reception area was empty when she arrived. She sat in the same chair as before, hands folded in her lap, and waited with a calmness that surprised her. This was the culmination of weeks of careful progress. Nothing about it required drama. Michael Reeves appeared precisely at 10. He guided her to the same conference room where documents were already arranged in neat stacks across the table. He sat across from her and began explaining each section with methodical patience. These documents establish the legal transfer of all assets from your aunt's estate to you personally. These establish the financial accounts where the assets will be held. These establish the trust structures we discussed for tax optimization and asset protection. These authorize me to act on your behalf in finalizing all transfers. He slid each document across as he explained it, showing her where to sign, where to initial, where to date. She read everything carefully despite his explanations, unwilling to sign anything she did not understand. He did not rush her. When she asked questions, he answered them fully. The process took 90 minutes. When the final signature was complete, he gathered all the documents, aligned them with precise movements, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read. "Congratulations," he said. "As of this moment, you are an extremely wealthy woman. The transfers will be executed today. By tomorrow morning, you will see the assets reflected in your accounts. The number will be substantial, more than most people can immediately comprehend. Do not panic. Do not make any large decisions immediately. Give yourself time to adjust." She nodded, trusting his guidance because she had no experience to contradict it. "One more thing," he continued. "I need to ask again. Have you told anyone about this?" "No one." "When do you plan to tell people?" She considered the question. "I need to tell my children soon. They will notice changes. Beyond that, I am not sure. My family, they will find out eventually. But I want to control when and how." "Smart," he said. "Your children will adjust more easily than adults. As for your family, remember that you are under no obligation to explain yourself. This is your inheritance. Your aunt chose you for a reason. How you use the wealth is your decision alone." The words settled over her like permission she had not realized she needed. She left the building and returned to her car, sitting in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Tomorrow morning, she would wake up with access to $246 million. Tomorrow afternoon, her life would begin to change in ways both visible and subtle. Tomorrow evening, she would start telling the people who needed to know, but today, right now, she existed in the space between old life and new. She was still the woman who worked at a grocery store, who worried about rent, who calculated every expense. But she was also the woman who had discovered hidden wealth, who had secured it properly, who would soon begin building something her children could depend on, and her aunt would have been proud of. She started the car and drove to pick up her children from her neighbor's apartment. They greeted her with casual affection, unaware that their mother had just signed documents that would alter their lives forever. She took them to school, kissed them goodbye, and watched them join the flow of students with a mixture of love and anticipation. Tonight, she would tell them. She would explain that their great aunt had left them something special, that their circumstances were about to change, that life was going to get easier in ways they might not immediately understand. She would prepare them gently, carefully, protecting their innocence while opening doors to possibility. But first, she had one more shift at the grocery store. One final day of the life she was leaving behind, she drove to work with unusual awareness, noticing details she normally overlooked. The way morning light filtered through the parking lot's trees, the sound of shopping carts being gathered, the familiar faces of co-workers arriving for their shifts. She clocked in, tied her apron, and took her position at Register 7. Deb arrived moments later, already complaining about something. Miguel waved from the produce section. Carol moved through the store with her usual efficiency, checking displays, talking to vendors, maintaining the careful operation of a business that existed on thin margins. She scanned items and made change, greeted customers, and bagged groceries. The work required no thought, allowing her mind to drift forward toward the evening ahead, toward the moment when she would sit her children down and explain that everything was about to change. A customer placed items on the belt. Milk, bread, peanut butter, generic brands, chosen for price rather than preference. She recognized the careful selection, the calculation behind each choice. She had made those same decisions countless times. "Your total is $347, she said. The customer, a woman roughly her age, counted out bills and coins with visible concentration. When she finished, she was 37 cents short. Her face flushed. "I'm sorry, let me put something back." Before she could stop herself, before she could think through the implications, she reached into her own pocket and placed 2 quarters on the counter. "Keep everything," she said. "It is covered." The woman looked at her with surprised gratitude. "Are you sure?" She smiled genuinely. "I am sure." The woman gathered her bags and left, murmuring, "Thanks." The gesture had cost her 50 cents yesterday. 50 cents would have mattered. Tomorrow 50 cents would be invisible, insignificant, a rounding error in accounts holding millions. But today, it meant something. It meant she remembered. It meant she understood. It meant that whatever changes tomorrow brought, some part of her would remain connected to the person she had been. Her shift ended at 3. She clocked out, untied her apron, and walked to her car without looking back. Tomorrow morning she would call Carol and give notice. 2 weeks, properly professional, no drama. But today was done, the last day of the life before. She picked up her children from school and drove home, her thoughts already organizing toward the evening ahead. Dinner first. Something simple but nice. Then conversation, careful explanation, reassurance that change would be good rather than frightening. The apartment welcomed her with familiar dimness, the afternoon light not quite reaching into corners. She set her purse on the counter and looked around at the space that had been home for 3 years. Small, worn, insufficient, but also safe, private, hers. Soon they would leave it. Soon they would move somewhere better. But tonight they were still here. Still the same family living the same life. Tomorrow could wait. Tonight was for transition, for moving gently from one reality to another. She began preparing dinner with unusual care, measuring ingredients, adjusting seasonings, treating the ordinary act of cooking as ceremony. Her children appeared from their bedroom, drawn by smells that suggested effort rather than necessity. "Are we celebrating something?" her son asked. She turned to face them. These two small humans who depended on her completely, who had endured poverty without complaint, who deserved everything she was about to be able to give them. "Yes," she said softly. "We are celebrating. Sit down. I need to tell you something important." They settled at the small kitchen table, their faces showing the particular alertness children develop when adults announce conversations will be serious. She had rehearsed this moment mentally dozens of times over the past weeks. But now that it had arrived, the prepared words felt inadequate. "Do you remember Great Aunt Margaret?" she began. Her daughter nodded. "She gave us cookies. She always asked about school." Her son added, "She died. We went to the funeral." "Yes," she said, grateful they had provided the opening. "When she died, she left me something in her will. Do you remember the mirror we brought home from her house?" "The big one in your room," her daughter confirmed. She took a breath, choosing her words carefully. Inside that mirror's frame, hidden where no one could see them, were papers, very important papers, stock certificates and bonds, things that represent ownership in companies. Great Aunt Margaret had been saving and investing for many, many years, and she left all of it to me. Her son's expression showed confusion more than excitement. "What does that mean?" "It means," she continued slowly, "that we are not going to have to worry about money anymore. It means that the things we have had to say no to, the things we could not afford, we will be able to have now. It means our life is going to change in good ways." Her daughter's eyes widened like we can get new shoes whenever we need them. The question, so small and practical, tightened something in her chest. "Yes, baby. New shoes whenever you need them, and new clothes and better food. And we are going to move to a nicer place, a house, maybe with your own rooms." Her son remained skeptical, his 8-year-old logic struggling with the concept. "But you always say we cannot afford things. How can papers in a mirror change that?" "Because those papers are worth a lot of money. More money than you can probably imagine. Enough that I will not have to work at the grocery store anymore. Enough that you can go to any school you want, any college later. Enough that we will be safe and secure for the rest of our lives." The words sounded impossible even to her own ears. Her children processed them with the particular adaptation of young people who had learned early that adult reality shifted without warning or explanation. "Are we rich?" her daughter asked, testing the word cautiously. She considered how to answer honestly without overwhelming them. "Yes, we are rich. But that does not mean we are going to change who we are. It just means life will be easier, less worry, less stress, more choices." Her son remained quiet, his expression suggesting he was working through implications beyond his immediate comprehension. Finally, he asked, "Will we still see our friends?" "Of course, you will still go to the same school. At least for now, we will not move right away. Changes are going to happen slowly, carefully. I promise I will not do anything that makes you uncomfortable." "Can we tell people?" her daughter asked. The question required careful handling. "Not yet. For now, this is our family secret. There are complicated grown-up reasons why we need to keep it quiet for a little while longer. Can you do that for me?" They both nodded, though she could see her daughter already calculating what she would say when the secret was eventually revealed. Children understood the social currency of information in ways adults often underestimated. They finished dinner with a mixture of normality and heightened awareness. Her children asked questions, some practical, some fantastical. Could they get a dog? Yes. Could they go to Disneyland? Yes. Could they buy a castle? She laughed, and the difference between very rich and fairy tale rich. A distinction they accepted with mild disappointment. After dinner, after the dishes were washed, and homework was checked. After baths were taken, and pajamas were put on, her daughter appeared in her bedroom doorway. "Mom, are you happy about this?" The question was more perceptive than expected. She patted the bed beside her and her daughter climbed up, settling against her side with familiar warmth. "I am," she said carefully, "but I am also scared. Change is hard even when it is good change. I loved your great aunt very much and I am sad that she is gone. But I am grateful that she thought to help us this way. Does that make sense?" Her daughter nodded against her shoulder. "I think so." "Are you going to tell Grandma?" The question struck at the heart of what she had been avoiding thinking about directly. Eventually, yes, but not yet. Grandma and Uncle James and everyone. They did not think the mirror was important. They laughed when I inherited it. "I want to wait until everything is completely settled before I tell them." The directness startled her. Her daughter had noticed more than she realized. "Not mean exactly," she said slowly. "But they did not understand. They made assumptions. And I want to prove those assumptions wrong." Her daughter considered this, then said with the simple clarity of childhood, "They are going to feel bad when they find out they were wrong." Maybe she agreed. "But that is not why I am doing this. I am doing this because your great aunt wanted me to have this opportunity. And I want to honor that by being smart about it." After her daughter returned to bed, she sat alone with her thoughts. Tomorrow morning, the funds would appear in her accounts. The number would be real, accessible, hers. The waiting would be over and the next phase would begin. She checked her phone one final time before sleeping. No messages from Michael Reeves, no last-minute complications. Everything was proceeding as planned. She set an alarm for earlier than usual, wanting to see the moment when the transfers completed, when possibility became certainty. Sleep came slowly, her mind too active to fully settle. She dreamed of numbers that shifted on screens, of bank statements that stretched for pages, of her aunt smiling without speaking. When her alarm sounded in the darkness before dawn, she woke feeling both exhausted and intensely alert. She dressed quietly, not wanting to wake the children yet, and opened her laptop at the kitchen table. The financials accounts Michael Reeves had established were accessible through a secure portal. She had logged in several times over the past weeks, always seeing the same thing. Empty accounts, placeholders waiting to be filled. She entered her credentials and waited while the page loaded. The interface was clean, professional, designed for people managing substantial wealth. When the account summary appeared, she stared at the screen without moving. The number was there, complete, precise, undeniable. 246,437,812 plus 63. She read it 3 times, her pulse steady, but her hands trembling slightly. This was not an estimate or a projection. This was her balance. Money she could access, transfer, spend, invest, give away. The restrictions that had governed every financial decision of her adult life had been removed in a single electronic transfer. She logged out, closed the laptop, and sat in the pre-dawn darkness of her kitchen. The apartment was silent around her. Her children slept in the next room. Outside, the city was beginning its daily transformation from night to day. Nothing external had changed, but everything internal had shifted irrevocably. When her children woke, she made them breakfast with unusual attention. Pancakes from scratch, rather than cereal from a box. They noticed immediately their excitement, suggesting they understood this represented a new pattern rather than an isolated treat. After dropping them at school, she drove not to work, but back to the apartment. She had called Carol the previous evening, leaving a voicemail saying she would not be in today, that a family situation required her attention. The lie came easily now, a small deception in service of a larger transition. She sat at her kitchen table with her phone and made the call she had been preparing for. Carol answered on the 3rd ring, her voice carrying the particular strain of a manager, dealing with staffing complications. "This is not a good time for you to be calling out. We are already short." "I know," she said, keeping her tone apologetic but firm. "I am sorry. That is actually why I am calling. I need to give you my notice. 2 weeks from today will be my last shift." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. "You are quitting?" Yes, a family situation has come up that requires my full attention. I am happy to work the next 2 weeks to help with the transition, but after that I will need to move on. Carol's response mixed frustration with bureaucratic efficiency. Fine. Send me an email with your formal resignation. I will need to start interviewing for your replacement. The conversation ended quickly, both of them eager to return to their separate concerns. She sent the required email immediately, keeping it brief and professional. Then she sat back, processing what she had just done. She had quit her job. The anchor that had structured her days, that had provided income, however inadequate, that had given her purpose, however unfulfilling, was now cut loose. In 2 weeks, she would no longer be an employee of a grocery store chain. She would be unemployed by choice, wealthy beyond measure, free to determine her own path. The thought brought both exhilaration and vertigo. Freedom, she was discovering, required its own kind of courage. Over the next days, she began making small changes, carefully calibrated, not to draw attention, but to test the reality of her new circumstances. She paid rent 3 months in advance, surprising her landlord into near speechlessness. She bought groceries without checking prices, allowing her children to choose items based on preference rather than cost. She replaced her car's worn tires, scheduled the repairs she had been postponing, filled the tank with premium gas. Each expenditure felt both natural and surreal. The money did not disappear from her account in any meaningful way. Hundreds of dollars spent might as well have been hundreds of cents. The math of poverty, where every dollar carried weight and consequence, had been replaced by the math of abundance, where only massive expenditures registered as significant. Her final 2 weeks at the grocery store passed in a fog of divided attention. She worked her shifts with the same efficiency as always, but her thoughts existed elsewhere, planning, calculating, imagining. Her co-workers noticed her distraction. "You seem different," Deb said one afternoon during their break. "Less stressed, maybe just tired," she lied easily. "A lot going on at home." Miguel asked if she was feeling all right, if she needed anything. Carol watched her with suspicion that never quite crystallized into accusation. They sensed change without being able to identify its source. On her final shift, she arrived early and left late, wanting to close this chapter cleanly. Deb hugged her goodbye, making a promise to stay in touch. Miguel gave her his daughter's graduation announcement, hoping she could attend. Carol shook her hand with professional formality and wished her luck, though the sentiment felt perfunctory. She drove home from her last shift, feeling lighter than she had expected. The job had not been meaningful, but it had been stable. Leaving it meant accepting that stability would now come from wealth rather than wages, a shift that required trusting something she had never before possessed. That evening, she took her children to dinner at a restaurant they had always passed, but never entered. The menu listed prices that would have been prohibitive weeks ago. Now they were irrelevant. She ordered appetizers, entree, desserts without hesitation. Her children's delight transformed the meal into celebration. As they ate, she studied their faces. They were young enough to adapt quickly to accept the changes as simply new normal. But they would remember this. She thought years from now, they would remember the transition from before to after, and this meal would mark the boundary. The next morning, she met with a real estate agent Michael Reeves had recommended. The woman, professional and efficiently perceptive, showed her properties in neighborhoods she had never considered accessible. Houses with yards, with multiple bedrooms, with updated kitchens and finished basement, spaces designed for comfort rather than mere function. She found herself overwhelmed by choices. Every house was possible. Every neighborhood was within reach. The limitations that had always governed her housing decisions, location, price, availability, had dissolved, leaving only preference as a guide. The agent noticed her hesitation. "I know this can feel daunting. Why don't you tell me what matters most to you? We can narrow things down from there." She thought carefully before answering. "Good schools for my children, safety, privacy, a place where they can be kids without worrying about noise or space." And she added after a pause, "Somewhere that feels like home, not like we are pretending to be something we are not." The agent nodded, understanding more than was said. "I know exactly what you need." 3 days later, she stood in the living room of a house that felt right in ways she could not fully articulate. It was substantial without being ostentatious, updated without being sterile. The yard was fenced, perfect for the dog her children had already begun campaigning for. The neighborhood was established, trees tall, and streets quiet. Most importantly, it felt like a place where her children could grow up normally, where wealth would support rather than define them. She made an offer that afternoon. It was accepted by evening. The cash purchase eliminated complications related to mortgages and approval processes. Within 3 weeks, the house would be theirs. She told her children over dinner, showing them photos on her phone. Their excitement was immediate and genuine, already planning which rooms would be whose, what color they would paint their walls, where the dog would sleep. That night, after they had gone to bed, she walked through the apartment for one final time. This space had sheltered them through difficult years. Its walls had absorbed their frustrations, their tears, their small victories. It had been inadequate in many ways, but it had been enough. She felt nostalgia for poverty itself, but she felt gratitude for what they had survived together, for the resilience they had developed, for the understanding that security came not from external circumstances, but from commitment to each other. The move happened over a single weekend. Professional movers handling everything with efficiency that made the process feel almost dreamlike. Her children ran through empty rooms claiming spaces, their voices echoing in ways that suggested possibility. She unpacked up boxes with care, arranging their belongings in the new house, with attention to creating comfort, rather than merely filling space. On their first night in the new house, she tucked her children into beds in their own rooms, separate spaces that still felt strange to all of them. Her daughter whispered that her room felt too big, too quiet. Her son admitted he was a little scared of the unfamiliar darkness. She sat with each of them, explaining that change required adjustment, that strange would become familiar, that they would learn to love this place as they had loved their small apartment. Eventually, they slept, and she moved through the house, turning off lights, locking doors, performing the rituals of securing a home that was truly theirs. Weeks passed in a rhythm of settlement and adjustment. The children adapted quickly to their new school, making friends with the easy confidence of young people, unburdened by adult complications. She established routines that balanced stability with flexibility, wanting them to feel both grounded and free. She had not yet told her family. The thoughts circled her awareness constantly, a task delayed but not forgotten. She knew the revelation would come eventually, that circumstances would force disclosure. She held on to the privacy a little longer, savoring the period when the transformation belonged only to her and her children. The decision was made for her when her mother called unexpectedly one Wednesday afternoon. She had not spoken to her mother since the funeral, their relationship having settled into a pattern of minimal contact and maximum distance. The call felt ominous immediately. "Where are you?" her mother asked without preamble. "I tried your apartment," someone else answered. "We moved?" she said carefully. "I have been meaning to call you." "Moved where?" The suspicion in her mother's voice was palpable. A house in Riverside Park. It was time for a change. The silence that followed carried weight. Riverside Park was not a neighborhood where people like them lived. Not people who worked at grocery stores, who struggled with rent, who made do with less. Her mother's next question came sharp and pointed. "How can you afford that?" The moment had arrived, not chosen, but unavoidable. She took a breath, feeling the weight of all the weeks of secrecy, all the careful planning, all the controlled transformation. It was time. "Do you remember Aunt Margaret's mirror? The one you all laughed about at the will reading?" Her mother's tone shifted, defensive now. "What about it?" There were documents hidden in the frame, stock certificates and bonds. Aunt Margaret had been investing for decades. She left all of it to me. "It is worth a lot of money, Mom." Life-changing money. The silence this time was absolute. She could hear her mother breathing, processing, trying to align this information with her understanding of how the world worked. "How much?" The question came quietly, almost fearfully. $246 million. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long she wondered if the connection had dropped. Then her mother's voice returned thin and uncertain in a way she had never heard before. "That's not possible." "It is," she said quietly. "I spent the past 2 months verifying everything with lawyers and financial advisors. The certificates were authentic. The transfers are complete. The money is in my account right now." She heard her mother sit down, the sound of a chair scraping against floor unmistakable. $246 million, her mother repeated, as if testing the words for truth, from stock certificates hidden in a mirror. Yes, Aunt Margaret had been investing since the 1960s. Small amounts, consistent contributions, companies that grew substantially over time. She never told anyone. She just kept building wealth quietly, and she chose to leave it all to me. But why you? The question emerged before her mother could stop it, revealing the assumption beneath. Why not me? She was my sister. The hurt in those words was real, and she felt an unexpected sympathy. Because, she said carefully, she knew I needed it most. She knew what my life was like. She knew I was struggling, and she trusted me to use it wisely. Her mother made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. We stood in that lawyer's office and laughed at you. We thought you got nothing. We thought the mirror was worthless. I know, I was there. The silence returned heavier now. When her mother spoke again, her voice carried a quality she recognized as shame. Poorly concealed by attempted pragmatism. All that money? She had anticipated this question, prepared for it during the weeks of secrecy. I am going to secure my children's futures, education, healthcare, everything they need. Beyond that, but I want to do something meaningful, something Aunt Margaret would have approved of. Your brother, her mother began, then stopped. He should know. The family should know. They will, she agreed. But I wanted to tell you first, you are my mother, despite everything that matters.
She heard her mother take a shaky breath.
Can I see you? Can we talk about this in person? Of course. Why don't you come to the house this weekend? Saturday afternoon, maybe. Bring whoever you want. The invitation was deliberate. She understood that her mother would not come alone. That word would spread through the family, like water finding cracks. By Saturday, they would all know, and they would all want to see for themselves that what they had dismissed so casually had transformed into something beyond their comprehension. After the call ended, she sat in her new living room, looking out at the yard where her children would soon be playing. The revelation had begun. Now came the harder part, facing the people who had judged her, who had found her lacking, who had laughed at an inheritance they assumed meant nothing. She spent the next days preparing, not anxiously, but deliberately. She wanted the house to look lived in rather than staged, comfortable rather than ostentatious. She wanted her family to see that wealth had not changed her character, only her circumstances. On Friday evening, she received a text from her brother. Mom told me, "We need to talk. I'm coming tomorrow with Mom." She replied simply, "I'll see you then." Saturday morning arrived clear and bright. She made breakfast for her children, helped them tidy their rooms, and explained that family would be visiting later. They accepted this with the mild interest of children, whose lives had become complex enough that adult gatherings no longer surprised them. Her mother arrived first at precisely 2. She was not alone. Her brother James followed, his expression unreadable. Behind them came 2 of her cousins, Sarah and Michael, both of whom had been particularly amused at the will reading. Last came her Uncle Robert, her aunt's widower hour, his face drawn with something that looked like grief, mixed with confusion. She opened the door and stepped aside, allowing them to enter without ceremony. They moved through the entryway seat, slowly, their gazes taking in details. The high ceilings, the hardwood floors, the furniture that was new but not excessive. Through the windows, the expansive yard stretched toward carefully maintained landscaping. Her mother spoke first, her voice tight. "This is the house. This is it." She gestured toward the living room. "Please sit down. Can I get anyone something to drink?" They settled uncomfortably on the sofas and chairs, refusing refreshments, their attention fixed on her with an intensity that felt almost physical. She took the remaining chair and waited, allowing them to find their own way into the conversation they had come to have. James broke the silence, his tone carrying the particular edge of someone who felt owed an explanation. "Mom says you inherited millions from Aunt Margaret. Hundreds of millions. 246 million to be exact." She kept her voice level factual. After taxes, about 153 million. Her cousin Sarah laughed, the sound sharp and disbelieving. "That's impossible." Aunt Margaret worked as a librarian. She lived in that tiny house. She drove a 15-year-old car. She lived modestly, she corrected gently. "There's a difference. She saved aggressively, invested wisely, and spent very little. Over 50 years, those habits accumulated into substantial wealth. And she left it all to you, James said. The unspoken question obvious. Why? She considered her answer carefully, aware that whatever she said next would define how this conversation proceeded. Because she saw that I needed it, because she trusted me to use it responsibly, and because she knew that leaving it to anyone else would have resulted in conflict or waste. Her mother flinched at the implicit criticism. I would not have wasted it. Maybe not. But no, you did not need it either. She kept her tone neutral, not accusatory. You have a comfortable life, Mom. You own your home. You have retirement savings, Dad's pension. You have security. I had none of that. Aunt Margaret knew the difference. Uncle Robert spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of loss that had not fully settled. She never told me all those years. And she never said a word about having that kind of money. She wanted to live normally, she said gently. She did not want money to change how people saw her or treated her. She valued relationships based on something other than wealth. I think that's why she hid it so carefully. In a mirror, Sarah said, still struggling with disbelief. She hid hundreds of millions of dollars in stock certificates behind a mirror. She nodded. Stock, certificates, bonds, letters, explaining everything. It was all there, preserved perfectly, waiting to be found. By you, James said, his tone hardening. Convenient that you were the one who found it. The implication stung, but she refused to rise to it. What are you suggesting, James? That I forged 50-year-old stock certificates? That I invented Aunt Margaret's handwritten letters? Everything has been verified by lawyers and transfer agents. This is not a scam or a mistake. This is exactly what Aunt Margaret intended. He had the grace to look away. Unable to maintain the accusation in the face of her calm certainty, Michael, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. What are you going to do with it? All that money? She had prepared for this question too, knowing it would come not from curiosity, but from calculation. First she said, I am going to secure my children's futures. College funds, fully established, trust funds that will provide for them even after I am gone. Healthcare, education, everything they need without exception. That makes sense. Her mother said carefully. Second, I am going to establish a foundation in Aunt Margaret's name. She loved education, particularly literacy programs. I want to fund libraries, reading initiatives, programs that help children from low-income families access books and learning resources. The specificity seemed to surprise them. She had clearly thought this through, made decisions that went beyond personal enrichment. The foundation would require at least 50 million, she continued. Possibly more. I want it to be substantial enough to make a real difference. And the rest, James asked. The rest I am still deciding. I have consulted with financial advisors about responsible investment, wealth preservation, ensuring the money can do good work for generations. But I am not in a hurry. Some decisions need time. Sarah spoke again, her voice softer now, the disbelief giving way to something else. We laughed at you at the will reading. We actually laughed, I know. I was there. The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Weighted with recognition of cruelty that could not be undone. Her mother looked down at her hands, her face flushed with shame. She seemed unable to articulate. James shifted in his seat, his earlier hostility deflating into something more complicated. I am sorry, her mother said finally. I am sorry we did not understand. I am sorry we dismissed what Margaret was trying to do for you. She accepted the apology with a slight nod, but did not pretend it erased the hurt. Thank you. That means something. Uncle Robert stood abruptly, his face working through emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. She would have been proud of you, Margaret. The way you are handling this, the plans you have made, she would have been proud. The words affected her more than she expected. A tightness formed in her throat, and she had to wait a moment before trusting her voice. I hope so. That matters to me more than the money itself. He nodded and moved toward the door. I need to go. It's a lot to process. She walked him out, watching as he moved slowly to his car, shoulders bent under the weight of discoveries that had come too late. When she returned to the living room, the others were standing, preparing to leave as well. Her mother approached, reaching out as if to embrace her, then stopping uncertainly. Can we? Would it be all right if I visited sometimes? Spent time with the children? She considered the request carefully. You are welcome to visit, she said finally. But things are different now, Mom. I am different. I will not accept judgment or criticism the way I used to. I will not let you or anyone else make my children feel less than they are. If you can respect that, then yes, you can be part of our lives. Her mother nodded, tears forming that she did not quite let fall. I understand. Thank you. James stopped at the door, his expression conflicted. For what it's worth, I am sorry too. We were wrong about you. All of us, she agreed simply. You were. After they left, she stood in the quiet house, feeling the weight of what had just occurred. The confrontation she had both dreaded and anticipated was over. They knew now. They understood that their mockery had been based on ignorance, that their dismissal had been catastrophically wrong, that the person they had pied was now beyond their reach in ways that could not be easily reconciled. She felt no triumph, only a quiet satisfaction that truth had been acknowledged. They had seen the house, heard the numbers, confronted their own assumptions. What they chose to do with that understanding was no longer her concern. Her children found her in the kitchen an hour later, where she was preparing dinner with her thoughts, still circling through the afternoon's events. Grandma seemed sad, her daughter observed. She was a little change is hard for everyone, not just us. Are we going to see her again? If she wants to see us, and if she treats us with kindness, then yes. Her son, more perceptive than his sister about adult complexities, asked, Did they know about the money before today? She crouched to his level, meeting his eyes directly. No. Today was the first time most of them learned about it. They were surprised. Were they mad? Some of them were confused. Some were sad. It is complicated, sweetheart. Adults do not always handle surprises well. He accepted this with the pragmatism of childhood. Moving on to more immediate concerns. Can we get pizza for dinner? She smiled, grateful for his ability to anchor her in present simplicity. Yes, we can get pizza. The weeks following the family revelation brought changes both expected and surprising. Her mother called regularly now, tentative at first, then with growing comfort. Their conversations remained somewhat formal, each of them navigating new boundaries, but connection was being rebuilt slowly. She appreciated the effort even when it felt awkward. James sent a text 2 weeks after the meeting. No words. Just a link to an article about literacy programs in underserved communities. She understood it as an olive branch, an acknowledgement that he had heard her plans and perhaps approved. She sent back a simple thank you. Sarah called one evening, her voice uncertain. I have been thinking about what you said about establishing a foundation. If you need help, if you want someone to work on that with you, I have experience with non-profit management. I would be honored to be involved. The offer was genuine, she could tell. Sarah was not asking for money, but for purpose, for a way to participate in something meaningful. She considered it carefully before responding. Send me your ideas about how it should be structured. Let's have coffee and talk about what a collaboration might look like. The foundation became her primary focus over the following months. She worked with lawyers to establish it properly with accountants, to ensure funds were managed responsibly with education specialists to identify where need was greatest and impact could be maximized. Sarah did join the effort, bringing organizational skills and genuine passion that made the work easier. They named it the Margaret Sullivan Redding Foundation, after her aunt's full name. The mission was clear: to provide books, literacy programs, and educational resources to children who lacked access to them. The initial endowment was $60 million, generating enough annual income to fund substantial programming while preserving the principle. The first grants went to school libraries in low-income districts, replacing outdated collections with current books chosen by the students themselves. Additional funding supported after-school reading programs, summer literacy camps, and initiatives that brought books directly into homes where owning them was financially impossible. She visited some of the programs personally, quietly, without announcement or recognition. She watched children select books with the kind of excitement she remembered from her own childhood, trips to the library with her aunt. She saw families receiving boxes of books delivered to their homes, parents grateful for resources they could not have provided themselves. Those visits reminded her why the wealth mattered, not for the luxury it afforded, though that was welcome, not for the security it provided, though that was precious, but for the possibility it created to change circumstances for others, to make paths easier, to open doors that would have remained closed. Her children adapted to their children's adapted to this new life. With the resilience of youth, they made friends in the neighborhood, excelled in their schools, pursued interests and hobbies that had been impossible before. Her daughter joined a ballet program she had once only dreamed about. Her son started music lessons, discovering a talent for piano that bloomed with proper instruction. But she worked deliberately to keep them grounded. They still had chores, still earned their allowances through completed responsibilities, still understood that privilege came with obligation. She talked with them regularly about the foundation, about why using wealth to help others mattered, about the difference between having money and being defined by it. The dog they had promised themselves arrived, a golden retriever puppy they named Copper, who brought chaos and joy in equal measure. The house filled with the sounds of children laughing, of music played imperfectly, of a family building a life that felt earned rather than merely bought. She thought often of her aunt during those months. The mirror that had contained the inheritance hung now in her bedroom, a daily reminder of discovery and trust. Sometimes she stood before it, studying her reflection, looking for signs of transformation. The face that looked back was different in subtle ways. The lines of exhaustion had softened, the weariness had eased. She looked, she thought, like someone who had stopped carrying impossible weight, who had been given permission to rest, but she was careful not to let comfort make her forget. She remembered grocery shopping with a calculator, remembered choosing between necessities, remembered the constant calculation of survival. Those memories were not painful now, but they were important. They kept her connected to the person she had been, to the struggles others still faced. A year after the inheritance had been transferred, she organized a gathering, not a celebration exactly, but an acknowledgement. She invited her family, her aunt's friends, people who had known Margaret Sullivan and loved her. The event was held at her house, casual rather than formal, focused on memory rather than wealth. Uncle Robert came, looking older but steadier than he had at their last meeting. He brought photographs of her aunt, pictures spanning decades that showed a life lived with quiet purpose. They spent an hour looking through them together, him sharing stories she had never heard. She was always reading, he said, pointing to a photo of Margaret with a book in her lap. Every night she would sit in that chair by the window and read for at least an hour. She said it was how she traveled without leaving home. She gave me that love of reading, she told him. Some of my earliest memories are of her taking me to the library, letting me choose whatever books I wanted. She never told me what I should read. She just made sure I had access. He smiled, tears forming that he did not try to hide. She would have loved what you are doing with the foundation. She talked about literacy programs sometimes, about how important they were, but she never had the means to support them the way she wanted. Now she does, she said softly. Through this, her mother arrived with James, both of them more comfortable now in their understanding of how things had changed. They brought food for the gathering, contributed to the afternoon without seeking special recognition. Her mother spent time with the children, genuine in her attention, careful not to overstep. Sarah came with her husband and teenage son, bringing updates about the Foundation's expanding programs. They had received applications for funding from over 200 schools and community organizations. The board, which she had helped establish, was reviewing proposals with care, choosing initiatives that would have lasting impact. As the afternoon progressed into evening, people gathered in loose groups, sharing memories of Margaret Sullivan. Stories emerged that painted a fuller picture than any single person had possessed. She had helped a neighbor through a medical crisis, providing financial support without being asked. She had tutored children in reading, never accepting payment. She had volunteered at the library long after her retirement, organizing book drives and literacy events. These were not the actions of someone who viewed wealth as power or status. They were the actions of someone who understood that resources gained meaning only through their use in services of something beyond self-interest. As the gathering wound down and guests began departing, her mother approached her in the kitchen where she was washing dishes. "Let me help," her mother said, picking up a towel to dry. They worked in comfortable silence for a few minutes before her mother spoke again. "I have been thinking a lot about that day at the will reading, about how we reacted when you inherited the mirror. You do not need to revisit that," she said gently. "It is in the past. I do, though. Her mother's voice was firm now, insistent, because I need you to understand something. It was not really about the mirror or its value. It was about my own disappointment, my own sense of failure. Margaret was my sister, and she was closer to you than she was to me. That hurt. And instead of examining why that hurt, or what I could have done differently, I diminished what she gave you. She sat down the dish she was washing and turned to face her mother fully. Why was she closer to me? Her mother took a shaky breath. Because I judged you when your marriage ended, when you struggled financially, when you made decisions I did not agree with. I judged you instead of supporting you. Margaret did not. She just loved you and showed up for you. And now seeing what you have done with what she left you, seeing the foundation, the way you are raising your children, the thoughtfulness of every decision, I understand why she trusted you with this. The admission cost her mother something to speak, and she recognized the courage required. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you might realize. Can we start over, not forget the past, but build something better going forward? She considered the question seriously, not from sentiment, but from genuine assessment of possibility. We can try, but it has to be real. Mom, I cannot go back to being someone you tolerate or pity. Either you accept me as I am, or we maintain distance. I am done pretending to be less than I am to make others comfortable. Her mother nodded, wiping her eyes with the dish towel. I accept you. I see you. And I am proud of you. Even though I have no right to be, since I did not contribute to who you have become, you are still my mother. That matters even when it is complicated. They finished the dishes together, and her mother left shortly after with James, both of them promising to visit again soon. She stood at the window watching them drive away, feeling something shift and settle. Forgiveness was not instant, but it was possible. Relationships damaged by years of judgment would not heal overnight, but they could be rebuilt with patience and honest effort. 2 years after discovering the inheritance, she stood in the library of a newly renovated elementary school in one of the city's poorest neighborhoods. The space was bright and welcoming, filled with new books arranged on shelves built to child height. Students browsed with obvious delight, selecting titles with care, some reading where they stood, unable to wait. The Margaret Sullivan Reading Foundation had funded this renovation, one of 47 similar projects completed in the past 18 months. She watched the children with quiet satisfaction, knowing that her aunt would have loved this, would have approved of every decision that had led to this moment. A young girl approached her, maybe 7 years old, holding a book about space exploration. "Is this really free?" she asked. "I can just take it home." "Really free?" she confirmed. "You can take as many as you want." The girl's face lit with disbelief transforming into joy. She hurried back to the shelves, returning moments later with 4 more books clutched against her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, then ran to show her teacher the treasures she had found. She felt tears form and did not try to stop them. This was why this moment, this child, this access to possibility that wealth could provide when used with intention and care. This was what $246 million meant when stripped of abstraction and transformed into impact. Her phone buzzed with a text from her daughter. "Piano recital reminder, 6:12 p.m. tonight, don't forget." She smiled, typing back quickly, wouldn't miss it for anything. Life had found a rhythm that felt sustainable rather than overwhelming. The wealth was managed responsibly, invested conservatively, structured to last for generations. The foundation operated with professional efficiency, its impact growing each year. Her children thrived, grounded and grateful, understanding their privilege without being defined by it. She still thought about her aunt daily, still felt the presence of that gift, like a weight carried not with burden but with purpose. The mirror remained in her bedroom, a daily reminder that value often hides in unexpected places. That judgment based on appearance misses truth. That trust placed wisely multiplies beyond measure. Some evenings when the children were asleep and the house was quiet, she would stand before the mirror as she had that first day in her aunt's empty house. But now the face looking back was not marked by exhaustion or defeat. It showed someone who had been given an extraordinary gift and had chosen to honor it through careful stewardship and meaningful action. She had not changed in the ways wealth often changes people. She had not become extravagant or careless or detached from the struggles of those with less. Instead, she had become more of what she already was. Someone who understood the value of resources because she had lived without them. Someone who could use privilege to open doors for others because she remembered what it felt like when all doors were closed. The family had settled into new patterns as well. Her mother visited weekly now, bringing groceries and helping with dinner. Their relationship rebuilt on foundation of honesty rather than pretense. James called occasionally with articles or ideas related to the foundation, contributing his thoughts without seeking credit. Sarah had become a genuine friend and collaborator. Their partnership in the foundation's work, creating connection beyond family obligation. Even her cousins, who had been so dismissive at the will reading, had reached out in various ways. Some offered help with foundation work. Others simply acknowledged their error and asked for forgiveness. She gave it freely, understanding that judgment often is from personal insecurity rather than genuine assessment. One Saturday afternoon, 3 years after that first discovery, she took her children to visit her aunt's grave. They brought flowers, simple daisies that Margaret had loved, and stood together in the quiet cemetery. "Do you miss her?" her son asked. "Every day," she answered honestly. "But I also feel like she is still with us in a way. Every time the foundation helps a child access books, every time we make a choice about how to use the wealth responsibly, I think about what she would want. It is like having her guidance even though she is gone." Her daughter placed the flowers carefully at the base of the headstone. She was really smart to hide all that money where no one would think to look. She smiled. Yes, she was. But the smartest thing she did was not hiding the money. It was knowing who to trust with it. She could have given it to lots of people, but she chose to give it to me because she trusted I would use it the right way. "And you have," her son said, with the simple certainty of childhood. They stood together for a few more minutes, 3 people bound by love and legacy, before returning to the car. On the drive home, her daughter asked about dinner plans. Her son talked about a school project due Monday, normal concerns, ordinary life, the kind of stable present that wealth had made possible, but that love made meaningful. That evening, after dinner was finished and homework completed, after stories were read and tucked-in rituals observed, she found herself alone with the mirror. She studied her reflection with the perspective that came from having lived both versions of her life, the before and after. The woman looking back was not fundamentally different from the one who had stood in her aunt's empty bedroom 3 years earlier. She was still the same person with the same values, the same commitment to her children, the same capacity for love and determination. But circumstances had changed everything about what she could do with those qualities. She thought about the family members who had laughed at the will reading, who had seen a worthless mirror where treasure waited. She thought about the assumptions people made based on appearances, about how easily judgment replaced understanding, about how often the overlooked and dismissed contained more value than the obvious and celebrated. Most of all, she thought about trust. Her aunt had trusted her with wealth that could have been given to anyone, had trusted her judgment, her character, her commitment to using resources wisely. That trust had been the real inheritance, more valuable even than the money itself. She had worked hard to honor it. Every decision about the wealth had been made carefully with consideration of impact and sustainability. Every program funded through the foundation had been evaluated for effectiveness and need. Every choice about her children's upbringing had balanced privilege with responsibility. The journey from that moment of discovery to this moment of reflection had transformed her understanding of what wealth meant. It was not freedom from struggle, though it removed many forms of hardship. It was not power over others, though it provided influence. It was not status or recognition, though those sometimes followed. Wealth, she had learned, was responsibility. It was stewardship of resources that could either be squandered or multiplied. It was opportunity to create impact beyond individual benefit. It was a tool that gained meaning only through intentional use in service of something larger than personal comfort. Her aunt had understood this. That was why she had lived modestly while accumulating millions. That was why she had hidden the wealth away from those who would have seen it only as personal treasure. That was why she had chosen carefully who would inherit not just the money but the obligation to use it wisely. Standing before the mirror that had changed her life, she made a silent promise to the woman who had trusted her so completely. The wealth would be protected, invested wisely, structured to serve generations. the foundation would grow, reaching more children, creating more opportunities, multiplying impact year after year. Her children would be raised to understand privilege as responsibility rather than entitlement. And she would never forget what it felt like to struggle, to calculate every expense, to worry about tomorrow. Those memories would keep her grounded, keep her connected to the reality most people lived, keep her focused on using resources to make that reality better for others. The house settled around her with comfortable sounds, the hum of appliances, the creak of wood adjusting to temperature, the distant sound of her children breathing in sleep. This was home now, secure and stable, a place where her family could grow without the constant pressure of scarcity. But it was also more than that. It was evidence of transformation, proof that circumstances could change, that trust placed wisely could multiply beyond measure, that overlooked people often possessed more strength than those who dismissed them realized. She turned away from the mirror, finally, moving through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, performing the evening rituals of security. As she prepared for sleep, her thoughts were not of wealth or vindication, or the ways life had changed. They were of gratitude for an aunt who had seen her truly, for children who brought joy daily, for the opportunity to make meaningful impact with resources she had never expected to possess. Tomorrow would bring new decisions, new opportunities, new ways to honor the trust she had been given. The foundation would continue its work. Her children would continue their growth. Her family would continue rebuilding connection on foundations of honesty rather than judgment. But tonight she simply felt grateful. Grateful for discovery, for transformation, for the chance to prove that trust had been placed wisely. Grateful that a mirror dismissed as worthless had contained not just wealth but possibility. Grateful that her aunt had understood something others had missed. That strength often wears the disguise of struggle, and that those who endure hardship without losing kindness are exactly the people who should be trusted with abundance. She fell asleep with the knowledge that tomorrow she would wake in a life that felt both impossible and absolutely real, that she had been given an extraordinary gift and had chosen to honor it through service, that the laughter of relatives who had dismissed her had been transformed not into bitterness, but into motivation to do better, be better, prove through action rather than words that their judgment had been catastrophically wrong. The mirror that had held her inheritance now reflected a woman who had traveled from poverty to wealth without losing herself in the journey, who had discovered that hidden treasure meant nothing until it was used to create meaningful change, who had learned that vindication comes not from proving others wrong, but from proving yourself right. And in the morning, when sunlight filtered through bedroom windows, when children woke with energy and excitement, when another day began full of possibility and purpose, the mirror would simply be a mirror again. Beautiful, valuable, but only one small piece of a life that had been transformed by trust, by discovery, by the wisdom of a woman who had known that the greatest inheritance was not money itself, but the responsibility to use it in ways that multiplied hope for others. The story that had begun with mockery and dismissal had become a story of transformation and impact, proving that value often hides where no one thinks to look, and that those who are overlooked frequently possess the greatest capacity for meaningful change. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already.